In this lecture, we want to look at the Ottoman Empire from the bottom up. Last time we discussed how the Sultan and his servants administered this vast world empire. Now we want to look at exactly what was life like in the Ottoman Empire and really describing, well, what was the Ottoman Empire, both in its size and its diversity. First, a couple of statistics are in order. When we're thinking of the Ottoman Empire in the time of, say, Suleiman the Magnificent, or perhaps the year 1676, when the empire was actually at its greatest territorial extent, it was well over 1 million square miles, maybe 1.2 million square miles. There's a bit of difficulty in counting the empire because there were a number of important vassal states. I've mentioned them only in passing. Wallachia and Moldavia, the two Romanian principalities, which were ruled by Christian princes, hospodars, who owed their allegiance to Constantinople, and they were really not under the direct administration of the Sultan. There were also numerous Turkic tribes, the so-called Crimean Tatars, various tribes north of the Caucasus, who were in close alliance with the Ottoman state and actually represented an outer ring of the Ottoman Empire that afforded them protection eventually from the rising power of Russia. These areas, however, economically were really part of the Ottoman state in many ways. There was also the Hungarian Principality, Transylvania, which is often regarded as part of the empire, although generally an independent prince ruled in Transylvania, while there was a governor in Buda to whom the prince was directly answerable. And then there were numerous Bedouin tribes in Saudi Arabia today that were loosely affiliated with the Ottoman state, and above all, the mountaineer Shiite tribes of Yemen, where there was always an Arab revolt in Yemen, but that's another issue. So when we look at the Ottoman Empire and its population, its core empire in, say, 1600 may have numbered around 18 million or so. But when you add in all these other areas that are associated with the Ottoman Empire and are economically part of the Ottoman Empire, you're pushing the empire up to about 22, 24 million. There have been estimates as high as 35 million, but those now seem to be much too high, much too sanguine. Now, our information from the 16th century is fairly good. I made reference to those tax registers. These are registers of the heads of household who are obligated to pay certain taxes. And above all, Christian and Jewish populations that had to pay a tax for the practice of their faith. That is the jizya, the head tax instituted back in the 7th century. And this gives us enough records in provinces where these registers have survived to give us some sense of the structure of the population and the size of the population. After 1600, we lose those registers, and that is a function of changes in state administration. The imperial government goes over to tax farming. That is, the collection of taxes are put up for bid in Constantinople and the provincial cities. Individuals, ions, leading notables buy the contract to collect the taxes, remit some of the taxes to either the provincial or central government, and reward themselves for their expenses as well as paying them profits. And this is an old system of tax farming which relieves the state of maintaining an expensive bureaucracy, or at least a financial bureaucracy, to keep records on this. But we lose as a result, and what we have in its place are largely legal documents presided from courts presided over by the Qadi, and this is just not the kind of information that give us the demography we want. Nonetheless, a couple of statements can be made about the overall population of the Ottoman state. And that is, it seems to be a fairly stable population, and if anything, there were periods of population decline, although the reasons for this is very difficult to pinpoint. Historians of early modern Europe speak of the Little Ice Age, a changed conditions that resulted in advance of the polar caps. It wiped out the Norse colony of Greenland. It led to cooler temperatures in northwestern Europe, which adversely affected certain types of agriculture. It is very difficult to trace these influences in 16th and 17th century provinces of the Ottoman Empire. There does seem to be periods of population relocation Certain areas of the empire get depopulated in the 17th and 18th century. Certain areas of the Fertile Crescent, there's a movement from villages to cities. Same phenomenon is noticed in the interior of Anatolia, that is Asiatic Turkey today, as well as the Balkans, especially regions of Macedonia, which now is astride Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, as well as the Macedonian Republic. But again, it's difficult to see whether these represent overall trends. What does seem to be the case is the population overall was fairly stable by pre-industrial standards. There was no demographic collapse. There could be great variations of famine and drought, which could affect populations. War was probably more of a disruption than climactic or disease, climactic changes or disease. And at least down to the end of the 18th century, as far as we can tell, the Ottoman rural economy could sustain the cities, the central administration, and the very expensive logistics of the Ottoman army, which we'll discuss in another lecture. So overall, we're looking at a pre-industrial society that had a fairly stable population. What clearly didn't happen in the late 18th century, which did happen in Europe, was the concentration of more and more people in the countryside with the introduction of new crops, such as the potato, that led to the massive, dense populations of Western Europe that would be characteristic of Europe of the 19th and 20th century. Nor do we see in the Ottoman state the kind of migration of that population to the cities that provided the labor for industrialization. The Ottoman economy remained essentially rural right up to 1914. And whatever efforts that were made at industrialization, we'll talk about in later lectures, was really quite limited to an overall rural economy. Another point we have to keep in mind is that the economy is probably influenced by the physical contraction and expansion of the empire. In 1600, the empire was at its greatest extent. Already in the early 19th century, there are severe economic losses. The first one is the loss of Egypt, which essentially breaks away and becomes an independent economy under Muhammad Ali, an Ottoman governor who turns himself essentially into an independent prince. And that occurs in 1805 to 1848. Another important loss was the fusion of the Romanian principalities in 1866 into the Kingdom of Romania, which in effect divorced itself economically from the Ottoman state. And that had major repercussions in the provisioning of Constantinople, because the stock raising and the wheat production of Romania was so important to sustaining the imperial capital. And so the contraction at the end of the 18th and 19th century had a lot more to do with territorial losses rather than any kind of inherent weaknesses within the Ottoman rural economy. So with those two figures in mind, the size of this empire and the population, let's take a look at what did it actually produce. Well, in many ways, the Ottoman Empire was a continuation of the previous traditions that could be traced back really to Imperial Rome. And there was enormous diversity within the empire, and the Sultan maintained the position that most of the lands of the empire belonged to him. They're known as miri in Ottoman legal texts, that is crown lands, and that could include most of the arable lands, mines, forests, many productive areas that were essentially in the gift of the Sultan. And the Sultan handed out the right to exploit these lands under various conditions. First and foremost were the Timars, which I've mentioned earlier. The Timar was a land grant devised by Osman and Orhan as a way of rewarding warriors and maintaining military forces without the need to collect direct taxes and disperse it from a central administration. The Timars are very, very well represented in Anatolia and in the Balkans, that is in the core provinces. They were later extended to the region of Aleppo and also Mosul, but they're not to be found in Greece. They're not to be found in most of the Arab provinces. They had very little to do at all in the vassal kingdoms. The Timariots, the men who held these grants of land, did not hold a hereditary title. It had nothing to do with a fief, and it didn't really approximate earlier Byzantine types of tenure, pronoia. What it did is establish a Muslim Turkish landlord class in the countryside who collected rents along traditional methods and used those to sustain cavalry forces available when they were summoned to military service. Now, they came in two sizes. One was a grant that yielded an income of 20,000 aksha, or akshalar, that is the basic silver coin of the Ottoman state, and the other was 50,000. When these grants were handed out in the 15th and early 16th century, this was a substantial amount of money. It meant you were a squire or almost an aristocrat on the countryside. And the Timariots doubled not only as landlords, but also as local arbiters and patrons, and they gave you a local Muslim elite in these core provinces of the Balkans and Asia Minor that was all important. And those provinces were decisive to the Ottoman state, particularly the Balkans. The Balkans is where perhaps 25% of the revenues of the state came in from its taxes. It was not only the land tax, the tax on the Christian populations, it was the timber, it was the mining resources, it was all the products coming out of those areas of Rumelia, as the Ottomans said, that were all important in sustaining the Ottoman state. The other area that was important was Egypt. And Egypt was under its own administration. The Timur was never extended there, and their traditional patterns of landholding were maintained, although ultimately all the land was in the gift of the Sultan. So from the start, the Sultan, in effect, maintained existing methods of production and cultivation, but asserted the legal right over the productive lands of his empire. And so the conditions of most peasants, once an Ottoman conquest was finished, probably didn't change all that much before and after the Ottomans arrived. Another important factor is that Ottoman imperial law, Kanun, did recognize certain forms of private property, and there were two that were very important. One were most peasants and even many people in towns had properties that could be inherited, could be alienated, and transferred. These included orchards. Sometimes it included olive trees without the land, which was the Sultan's, and that got into complicated cases. For the Christian populations, the vineyards, the orchards, the olive groves, those were all private property. Gardens were regarded as private property in the villages. Most rental properties in cities were private property that could be inherited and conveyed under either Islamic law or, if it was one of the dhimmi, that is the Jewish or Christian communities, according to their legal traditions. And those were not disturbed by the Sultan at all. Those continued right into the 19th century with very, very little change. In addition, the Sultan could allow various members of the Islamic community to take property, including Timars, and turn them into something known as a fakuf. A fakuf was an endowment. We encountered them earlier in the Seljuk period. There they were endowments to maintain the caravanserai, but they could be used for any kind of charitable Islamic activity you would like. And they were very, very prominent in the city of Constantinople, for instance. Suleiman set up a number of endowments. But starting at the end of the 16th and beginning of the 17th century, many of the holders of Timars turned their property into a fakuf for several reasons. First, there was a steady inflation, which was brought on as a result of all this Spanish-American silver flooding into the markets of the Old World. And it drove up prices considerably. Your basic Ottoman silver coin, the akçe, was exchanged against the Venetian ducat, the gold coin, which was the international currency of the Mediterranean world well into the 18th century. And that ducat did not change. That ducat remained a stable coin. Well, in the time of Suleiman, the exchange was 60-1. By the time you get to the end of the 17th century, it's already 400-1 and rising, and the way military cost had been met was by debasing the silver currency. Well, that meant many of the Timars crashed in value, and the holders of those Timars had great trouble in meeting their military obligations, as well as just sustaining themselves. The Timar, as I said, was simply the grant of the right to exploit the land. The ownership was still with the Sultan. And there's periodic redistribution of Timars and confiscation of them. And this occurs well into the 19th century, and various land reforms of the 19th century have often been misunderstood. These are the reforms that were promulgated by the reformers of Tanzimat Those are the forward-looking conservatives who are trying to reform the Ottoman Empire in response to the European threat. And there they've been hailed sometimes as, oh, you see, the Sultan is taking over all these old land forms of exploitation, Timars, and getting rid of this quote-unquote feudal system and handing out private property. There's nothing of the sort. What the Sultan's government was doing was reasserting its rights, its proprietary rights over these properties, and redistributing them to people who could exploit them far more productively than the previous holders. So always the rights of usufruct, that is, the right to exploit the property, was the only thing that was handed over by the Ottoman state to the various landlords and proprietors, whoever they may be, whether they owed military service or not. So this land pattern, as I say, persists only in the core areas. When you move into the Arabic provinces, their Timars were never implemented, and traditional land patterns, as far as we can tell from the legal documents, persisted. And so the legal arrangements, the rents that you would find in the Nile Valley, in the Tigris-Euphrates, and the lower Iraq, they had not changed significantly. In addition, the daily lives of most peasants in the Ottoman Empire probably had not changed significantly. Now, in the Nile Valley, the methods of exploiting the Nile were the same in many ways as they were in pharaonic times. However, there were improvements. First, peace and security was brought in by the Ottomans. The Mamelukes were seen as unusually corrupt and hard masters. Second, in the Nile Valley, new crops were such as sugar and rice were emphasized because these now went to feed Constantinople. And there was specialization in the agriculture in Egypt to support the capital. The same was true in Iraq, where different types of crops were cultivated to meet the growing demand of the cities of the western arm of the Fertile Crescent, notably Damascus and, above all, Aleppo, which were two of the key cities in the Fertile Crescent in the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire. So the lives of peasants changed in part in response to that demand. In the Aegean areas, Greece, the western shores and southern shores of Asia Minor, Mediterranean dry farming persisted as it always did, based on the intercultivation of grains with olives and grapes. Large Christian populations were still to be found throughout Asia Minor up until 1923, and wine production was still quite plentiful in much of Asia Minor down to that time, and has actually persisted in parts of Turkey to this day. And so that pattern of agriculture didn't change. There were, however, significant changes in the Balkans, and those are attested in two different ways. One is the whole organization of production in the Romanian principalities. This would be the shipment of goods to feed the city of Constantinople, which were exacted as a kind of tax. The other is the development in the 17th and 18th century of the çiftlik, or the çiftlikler in the plural. And these were commercial farming ventures in what is now the Lower Balkans, which designed commercial crops, again, to meet Constantinople. And they're very often misunderstood, again, as a move to private property, to somehow getting into the global economy. And they really were right within the traditional tenurial arrangements of this pre-industrial economy, and were really designed to support internal consumption rather than an export trade, which we'll talk about more in the next lecture. Finally, there were other improvements that came generally to the Ottoman Empire with the discovery of the New World. This included the introduction of maize, which had a very, very important impact in the Middle East. It was used for feeding animals. It, for instance, revolutionized villages in Greece, especially in the area of Larissa, which allowed stock raising in areas that had not been previously possible. Another very important commodity that came in was tobacco. And there was also, again, a great deal of debate within the religious schools whether the smoking of tobacco was acceptable or not. And if we could just digress for a moment of one of the achievements of the Ottoman economy, and that is not only was the introduction of tobacco from the New World very, very successful in the 16th and 17th centuries, another product made its way from Abyssinia, and that was coffee. The anecdotal evidence about the origins of coffee consumption in the Ottoman Empire are too delicious not to discuss, to omit in this class. According to what we're told, somewhere in the time of probably the reign of Bayezid II, it was noticed in Abyssinia that goats became more powerful when they browsed on the beans of the coffee plant, and that they bounced all over the hills of Abyssinia, and that they discovered that these beans had a quality, caffeine, and it would heighten one's senses and sensibility, and they very quickly learned to brew it. And by the early 16th century, coffee had penetrated into the Ottoman Empire. And coffee was very quickly combined with tobacco. And so the classic hookah shops, smoking tobacco, the consumption of coffee, those things are, that's a product of the Ottoman economy. There was no precedent really for that earlier. They were sometimes combined with wine shops, and invariably these shops were supposed to be run by Christians or Jews. Muslims were not supposed to get engaged in this. And the religious schools themselves were very divided over the importance of coffee. Some of them thought it was like wine. It was a fermented beverage. It took you out of your normal state. Therefore, it's forbidden by the Quran. But generally, most of the schools thought that coffee and alcoholic beverages were separate, and coffee was eventually accepted. And then its transmission to Europe is usually associated with legends that retreating Ottoman armies at Vienna, either in 1529 or 1683, left their coffee pots, and the Austrians came upon it and said, "Oh, what is this stuff?" And then coffee drinking took off in Western Europe. But the reason I dwell on that is to show that while the Ottoman economy, while its economic life was traditional, it was hardly static. That the Ottoman rural economy responded to the central administration, the maintaining of this professional army we'll talk about, the realignment of trade routes, the emergence of new cities. All of that economy was able to feed the growing cities and the changing patterns of trade routes in the Ottoman Empire, and quite successfully for almost 300 years. Now, European travelers who went into the Ottoman Empire from the end of the 17th century through the 18th century found it very curious. To them, the countryside looked apparently empty in comparison to Western Europe. But again, they're looking at the empire through their own eyes, through what they expect is the norm. They're thinking of the agricultural patterns of France or Western Germany rather than conditions of the Middle East and the Balkans, which are really quite different patterns of farming. Finally, I would like to very much stress that the Ottoman Sultan and his governments put great emphasis on the fact it was their obligation to maintain the wealth and prosperity of the Raya, of the general class. And it was the responsibility both of the state officials and then later the tax collectors, the tax contract people, the ions. And very often you have to remember that the representatives in the countryside of the central government or the local notables were also landlords, and that there wasn't that much distinction between city and countryside. Cities in any pre-industrial economy are relatively small. Constantinople was 1 million. Cairo might have been 250,000, but most cities fell between 50,000 and 100,000. And many of them were really more like 20,000. And this is towns in our mind. And so it's very easy to apply analysis to this economy based on our own perceptions. And the elite in the cities, the guilds, the ions who collected the taxes, they all had estates in the countryside. And the difference between country and city, well, it's a matter of just a very short walk. If you want to get an idea of what an Ottoman city was like, go to the current city of Iznik, ancient Nicaea. It was a great city for tile production. It prospered in providing the tile for the great building programs. But it was always a small city, about 20,000 at most, even at the height of its prosperity in the 16th century. And when you walked outside the old Byzantine walls that had been rebuilt by the Seljuks and the Ottomans, you're in the countryside immediately. And you always have to keep in mind that this interplay between country and city was just a common feature of economic life since really the beginning of agriculture. Pastoralists and nomads are another group who contributed very significantly to the rural economy of the Ottoman Empire, and they often get missed. because they do not appear very often in the tax registers. They're certainly not recorded very much in legal texts, which are largely the texts relevant to the cities. And above all, they don't leave the kind of physical evidence that farming communities do. Nonetheless, they proved a very, very vital part of that economy, and the government in Constantinople had very mixed feelings about pastoralists. In the one hand, the Sultan was a Ghazi by descent. And a Ghazi warrior was, without a doubt, a product of that pastoral nomadic society that you see so well on the steppes of Central Asia. On the other hand, he was also the caliph. He was the successor of the traditions of both the Abbasid Caliphate and even Imperial Rome. And throughout the Ottoman period, there was always a tendency for the central government in Constantinople to settle pastoralists and nomads as agriculturalists. And this led to a great deal of tension, especially in areas of eastern Anatolia, on the desert rim of the Fertile Crescent, and in certain sections of the Balkans, where there was always an interplay between grasslands for stock raising or draining those areas and putting them under cultivation. And in Asia Minor, this led to repeated rebellions by the Chalale groups. These were out-of-the-work soldiers and Turkoman nomads and pastoralists in eastern and central Anatolia who rocked Ottoman administration in the 16th and early 17th centuries. There are at least 3 major rebellions, and they were in protest of the state trying to settle these people so they could tax them more efficiently. Furthermore, pastoralists were always regarded as somehow barbaric and subject to heterodox religious beliefs. And this could be dangerous to the central government, which styled itself as the defender of Sunni Islam. On the other hand, these people provided very, very important commodities for the rural economy. And this has been demonstrated in a series of studies of the interplay between the villages and agriculturalists and the pastoralists or nomads. The pastoralists provided the dairy products, the meat, the hairs of horses, the wool of sheep, the leather of the cattle, which were so important as commodities for the settled communities. The settled communities, in return, provided manufactured goods. And these would be the goods of essentially village economies, handicraft items. It also provided vegetables, fruits, the carbohydrates of wheat and rice. And so there was a constant interchange. It's well documented how this arrangement, which emerged in central Anatolia in the 12th and 13th centuries, persisted really down to 1923. In Central Asia Minor, the Christians continued to dwell in the river valleys, the tributaries of the Halys River, the Kızıl Irmak, as the Turks would call it, the Red River. And they produced all of those commodities plus wine up until 1923, and they swapped them with the pastoralists, the Turkoman on the Cappadocian Plateau, for all of those products such as dairy products, salted meat, and the like. And that interplay, which goes back at least into the 12th century, persisted through the entire Ottoman period. And there were similar such arrangements in the Fertile Crescent. Above all, in the Fertile Crescent, the pastoralists were all important for breeding camels for the caravan trade, and above all, the trade for the Hajj. And all nomads and pastoralists always ran their animal herds over the grain fields after harvest, and that led to natural fertilization of the area. And so while there was this ambiguous relationship between the central government and all the nomadic and pastoral groups, on the ground in the countryside, there was a symbiosis. The Bedouin Arabs held a particularly important place in the economy. They provided the security for the Hajj routes, that is, the routes taking off from Damascus or sometimes from Baghdad, crossing the Arabian desert to go to Medina and Mecca. And this was an enormous pilgrimage trade in which the Bedouin tribes would provide the security. They also patrolled the desert rim, and they kept down brigandage. And in some extent, they exacted taxes on the rural communities that were sometimes looked more upon protection money, but nonetheless, they performed this important role which kept security along the rim, and an Ottoman government who did not come to terms with these Arab Bedouins was in real jeopardy. Well, In conclusion, I want to stress that while this was a traditional economy, while it did not show the changes you see in the European economy, it was successful. In part, it was premised on different notions than the European economy, and we'll talk about them in the upcoming lecture. The Ottomans did not believe that it was necessary to increase manufacture of goods, to distribute them more widely on a cheaper scale, to fight for expanding markets. Their view was a more traditional view, a view more in keeping with all the traditional empires before them. It was the duty, the God-given duty of the Caliph Sultan to protect the Raya, to make sure that their produce sustained the imperial court, the army, his servants, and to provide justice and security to all of his diverse subjects in the countryside. Now, this did not lead to mass capital formation. It did not lead to a shift of labor forces in the villages and the towns. But it did lead to a social and political security within the Ottoman Empire, that the basic needs of the population were met, and that most of the population of the Ottoman Empire was willing to accept the Caliph Sultan as their ruler. And that meant a great deal to the overall success and prosperity of the Ottoman Empire for over 3 centuries.